You are watching Procurement and Supply Chain Live. Now, our next speaker is Alexei Burns, who is head of procurement at UK-based Castle Trust Bank. Now, prior to this, Alexei was chief of staff to the CPO at Centrica. Alexei has deep experience of leading comprehensive transformations of procurement functions across multiple industries in multinational business environments. Now, today, Alexei will be talking about digital procurement transformation, really crucial subject. So, Alexei, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean, and hello everybody. I hope you're having a fantastic time at Procurement and Supply Chain Live. So, as Sean just talked about there, the talk that I want to give today is around digital procurement transformation, and actually it's going to be around an analogy that I think is quite apt. And actually, if we look at the three states of matter, what can we learn from the three states of matter? What characteristics and behaviors can we look at to try and take some guidance from when we think about transforming procurement digitally? So if we just move across to the next slide. So three states of matter: we have gases, we have solids, and we have liquids. And actually those three different states have different characteristics and behave in different ways. And actually they have pros and they have cons, but each one is inherently different. And if we look at those three things and think about how might we take that approach when we're looking at transformation, which if we look at the survey here from Deloitte, so in 2021, 76.1% of CPOs have digital transformation as a top priority. So that's an increase from 2019. And actually, if we look historically, year on year, the prioritization of technology and the use of technology within not just the procurement function, but organizations across every function has grown exponentially. As we look to underpin our businesses with technology, that trend is only going to continue. I've just taken a snippet there from Wikipedia's definition of digital transformation, and I actually think it's quite important to look at that and actually think about what does digital transformation mean. And if we see there at the bottom there, we've got that actually transformation is not necessarily the changing of something. So it's not necessarily old to new or analog to digital. Actually, the adoption of technology and the adoption of digital can be the impetus and the creation of something completely new. So from a procurement perspective, that might be the ability to have new capabilities that haven't been realized up to now, or be able to offer the business that you're in value in a way which you've not been able to do before. And that's through the use of digital, and that's through the use of technology. I think this is probably a statement that actually many people within procurement will understand. So procurement and procurement's value proposition, we wrestle with it. Why do we wrestle with it? You know, if I'm sure we'd all be pretty rich if we had £1 for every time we heard the phrase "seat at the table," and this almost, you know, identity crisis that procurement seem to go through, I don't necessarily think is an insecurity, and I actually think it's a byproduct of one of the best things about procurement, and that's because procurement's role is so diverse across any organization. Procurement will be serving their business in different ways, and if we think about from a three states perspective, well, what does that mean? Actually, it means that procurement tends to be quite flexible, tends to kind of fit into gaps and find opportunities that actually some of its other group function brethren, whether it's finance, whether it's legal, whether it's compliance, actually they might be more rigid. So if we think about what does that mean, well, let's take finance as an example. Agnostic of industry or agnostic of business type, predominantly finance will be managing and controlling the financial resources of that organization. And actually legal and compliance, they're doing the same things, and actually there isn't too much tolerance left or right. So if we think of that from a three states perspective, we'd say they're very solid, and actually procurement have some kind of core kind of responsibilities, that the value proposition is quite consistent, but then there's a tremendous amount of flexibility to the left and to the right for what procurement may or may not do within any organization. So for me, when we think about procurement's value proposition and the wrestling of it, I actually think it's a tremendous opportunity. And I love the fact that working in procurement means we are able to kind of push and pull in so many different areas. And there I just talked when we were thinking about what finance might look like from a three states perspective. And I said, well, you could look at finance and think of it as quite a solid state type function. So if we think about that, and we think about, well, what does that actually mean, and what can we learn from that from a digital transformation and procurement perspective? No matter or regardless of what procurement does or doesn't do within the organization, if procurement wants to grow and evolve and increase its value proposition, actually using technology as the spearhead for that change can be fantastically valuable. So the way in which you can use technology now to further procurement's agenda within the organization means that you can do it in a way that's never been done before in terms of speed, but also in terms of precision. When we think about the ROI and actually understanding from a proof of concept perspective to an implementation perspective, if there's going to be value there. So when we think about test and learn and we think about agile, actually technology is a massive enabler for procurement to move fast through its digital transformation. And if we think about those three states that we talked about, let's just have a think about what are those characteristics and how might they be beneficial when it comes to transforming. So we'll just jump into some science classes for a moment, and just to draw your attention, I suppose, to those three different states. So those three states are all different, but actually you can have a journey from kind of solids to gases, and you're going to pass through liquid if we think of it as a kind of linear curve. So gas, what's a gas? So gas is it doesn't have a regular pattern. It can move freely, it can vibrate against each other, it can move at very, very high speeds, and it can assume different shapes to fit in. So if we think about from a business perspective and from a digital transformation perspective, finding opportunities to say, we think we can add value there. Actually, what can we do? What can we implement with technology to go find that opportunity to see if we can realize that value, and then see if we can make that part of procurement's value proposition. And then we think about liquid. Well, liquid is similar to gas in that there isn't a tremendous pattern, there isn't too much conformity, but as much as they move freely, there is a coming together with liquid, and there is there's a more of a cohesiveness than we get with gas, which is interesting. I think we'll come back to that. And then we move to solid. So solid particles are tightly packed together, very patterned, very regular, very repeatable and predictable. And actually a solid is key, right? If we think about procurement and procurement's value proposition, the core is the solid. So what procurement are going to be measured by on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month basis, and on an annualized basis, is probably going to be around your kind of core proposition, which you clearly want to keep as stable as you possibly can. So if we think about solids being stable and gases being maybe less stable but are able to move faster, that starts to build a picture of, well, what might that look like from a transformation strategy perspective? So as we move from the bottom left to the top right there, we can see that we've got our solid state, and actually that's very stable. And then as we move to the right, we speed up, but then we also get less stable. So there's a trade-off as we move through those different states. And actually, the analogy of these different states can be used to form an approach to how you undertake digital transformation in procurement. So if we think for a moment and we think about procurement's core offering, very solid, very well understood, very repeatable, and actually we're really confident in procurement being measured against its core offering. But then we think about opportunities that arise, and this may be, down to a change in business direction. This may be down to a piece of technology has provided some value which is very, very obvious, or this may be down to some geopolitical or some environment change which has led there's a requirement which needs to be looked at. Let's think of that opportunity as gas. So we've got our solid base, and then we've got this opportunity, which is gas, and we're moving fast to that opportunity, and we're going to deploy some technology rapidly to try and address that opportunity, to try and create some value with that opportunity. And the journey is, how do we get to that opportunity quickly? Well, we use gas because it moves fast and it moves freely, but actually we need to get ultimately that opportunity back into our core procurement offering to increase procurement's value proposition in a stable way. So let's move to the next piece there, because the state that we haven't talked about is liquid. So we've got our core offering, we've seen an opportunity, we've deployed some technology fast, and actually now it's about moving from gas to liquid. So we need to embed that service to understand how that service complements the architecture that's already in place in regards to the technology stack within procurement, and actually really prove out that ROI to make sure that fundamentally that opportunity can be realized and can be incorporated into procurement's core value proposition. So as that technology and process becomes established, we can then move it from gas to liquid to solid state. And solid state, as we've talked about, is really where we want to be, where we want to be measured against, and where we really want to be able to define the progress that we've made, growing the procurement function and growing the value that that procurement function can offer to its business. So fundamentally, if we think of those three states and that cycle that we've just completed, what have we done? Well, we've seen the opportunity. We've then embedded and we proved that ROI, and then we worked to move finally from liquid back to solid, where we've solidified that new capability and we've brought it in to the core procurement offering. And then there's a stabilization period, and ultimately procurement's value proposition to the organization has grown, right? And we've done that in a way where we have kept a stable core. So we've kept the lights on, and procurement's bread and butter continuing to deliver in the way in which it has to deliver. But actually, we've used technology to rapidly spot an opportunity and move like a gas into a hole within the organization where there's some value. And then we've expanded, we've gone in fast, and then we've looked to draw back from a gas to a solid. And actually we passed through that liquid stage to do it, and we've embedded it and we proved the ROI, and ultimately we've then solidified that proposition to grow procurement within the organization. So to summarize this talk today, this lens of the three states I think is a really good one to have when you can read so much on digital transformation, so much on best of breed, microservices, full suites. The sequencing and the prioritization is really, really key for how you use technology within the procurement function. And actually, if we think about where we are within the world today and the pace at which businesses are having to move to keep up with global demand, this approach to digital transformation might help you realize some successful projects by looking at a core solid state and then actually moving fast with the kind of the lens of using like a gas-like approach, and then you're drawing back through liquids, and then you're solidifying that to ultimately grow procurement's value proposition. And if you understand those core kind of core values that procurement has, and then you identify areas or opportunities which can be deployed to, then you might find this analogy has some value for you. So I hope that talk was of some use, and I'd welcome anyone to reach out to me if you want to continue the conversation.
Alexei, thanks ever so much for that. That was really fascinating. The way you're drawing that parallel between solids, gases and liquids, and the dynamics of what needs to happen. When you're going through a transformation process in terms of, identifying opportunities and turning them into something that can add elements to a procurement function, and eventually, embedding it into the core function that becomes stable and just an accepted way of doing things. And I was just wondering, I was going to ask you, do you see that way of working and that approach, holding for a number of years to come? Do you think that this is the future for procurement in the next sort of 5 or so years?
I think it is, Sean, to a certain extent, right? I think that actually there is an element of procurement which is fairly stable. So if we think about the kind of the source to contract and the P2P cycle and procurement's kind of ownership of some of those processes, that's fairly kind of traditional procurement, right? And if we think about something like category management and effectively the being responsible for a portion of an organization's spend and trying to apply some commercialism to make sure that actually those organizations are spending money in the right way with the right suppliers, I think that that's quite core. But actually, I think that as procurement evolves, and we've seen over time, this kind of we're going to utilize technology more, and we're going to perhaps utilize people a little less. And actually, there's more of a kind of narrative around soft skills and EQ, and actually being able to be that more strategic advisor type role to the organization. I think that's fine. I think that all stands. But I think there's more to it. I think if we think of procurement as a shape, some in some organizations there might be a square where there's kind of 4 sides to procurement. Some organizations you might be a triangle, and some you might be a hexagon. You might have many shapes, many sides. And I think that that's the thing, Sean. I think that actually procurement's evolving, and there are just going to be more sides to procurement. And actually, as technology enables procurement functions specifically, it enables us to do so much more with so much less. We're able to evolve and create more sides to our shape, so we can really start to deliver more value in areas that we haven't done before. And I think actually, if we think the next 5 years, I think that trend's set to continue for sure.
And it's quite interesting, isn't it, when you look at the evolution of procurement, particularly over the past couple of years, or, pre-pandemic, through the pandemic, and now sort of coming out of the other end, where procurement really was seen as a cost control center as much as anything, wasn't it? But now it's far more strategic, isn't it, in what it has to bring to the overall enterprise?
Yeah, it is. And I think that is, partly down to the fact that, I think what I've kind of tried to kind of metaphorically talk about in this talk is if we think about procurement end to end within an organization, and let's just say that there are kind of, I don't know, from a process perspective, there might be kind of 20 process points along that end to end journey. And there are handshakes between procurement and finance and legal and compliance and the business. And there are all of these overlaps. And actually, there's lots and lots of gaps for things to fall down. And there's lots of, but as we talk about gaps, there are also opportunities. So if we think about COVID, a really, really good example, there were gaps from a supply chain risk management across lots of organizations for how they manage those risks. And actually, the business very, very quickly turned inwards on themselves and said, who's best placed to address these gaps and how are we going to fix this? And procurement, in a lot of examples and a lot of cases, stepped in like that gas, moved in very, very quickly, and created a value proposition where there wasn't one before. And then they expanded, and then they turned that gas to a liquid, and now it's part of procurement within that organization. And the business understood very quickly that procurement fixed that problem for us, and then the value proposition grew. And I think that's fundamentally what we've been talking about today, right? And COVID was a really good example of that, where there was an opportunity, a forced opportunity, where procurement stepped up very, very quickly and really kind of excelled to show how its value can be shown to the organization that it sits within.
So, and I know you're relatively new to your current role, aren't you, Alexei, at Castle Trust Bank?
Yeah.
But in the the 4 or 5 months you've been there, what flavour have you got of what transformation looks like within Castle Trust?
Yeah, so I mean, Castle Trust is, it's an organisation that's growing at kind of quite an exponential rate. Actually, they're moving up the maturity curve very, very quickly. And actually, as a bank, there's a huge amount of work that we have to do to ensure that we are working in the right way. But from a kind of digital transformation perspective, specifically in procurement, actually, my feeling is that we really need to kind of establish procurement in the right way. So it's very easy when we're in the place that we're in for procurement now. It's saturated in terms of technology and technology providers. If you look at any component of procurement in isolation and you look at any SaaS product, it's very, very easy to find a return on investment. And actually, you can end up with the tail wagging the dog, where you can just be led here and go, shiny, new, I can drive some value. Okay, fantastic. Let's go after that. Let's digitize that element of procurement. And then you can actually move over here and you can find your next shiny new thing that you can say, okay, we're going to integrate that. We're going to embed that. But actually what you might end up with is a bit of a patchwork quilt that, from an integration perspective, after your 1 to 2 years where that initial return on investment, you've kind of bled that asset, and now actually you're trying to draw a kind of more medium to longer term strategy, it can become quite difficult to do that. So my priority at the moment is to make sure that we're supporting the business in the right way to help them grow at the speed at which they want to grow. But actually, fundamentally, we need to really focus on building some transparent business processes that make up the source to contract and the purchase to pay cycle, incorporating all of those teams that we've talked about in this talk today. Because once you've got that established, it's then very easy to overlay technology to drive all sorts of benefits, some of which we've talked about today. So I think there's a sequencing when we talk about digital transformation, and there's actually a right way of doing something to make sure that the first thing you do doesn't dictate everything else that you end up doing, because I think there you can kind of fall down, and it's something that I've kind of experienced before.
Because I've spoken to consultancy companies about digital transformations, and of course there's a human element in that too, isn't there? In that sometimes companies and people can be resistant to change, and the process of transformation has its challenges, doesn't it? And I was sort of wondering what would be your top tips for making sure that transformation processes proceed smoothly as possible, and end up delivering benefits to the business.
Yeah, so I think I'll probably build a little bit on what I really just talked about, Sean, because I fundamentally think that for when we're talking about transformation, we're talking about people, inherently, that a reaction to change it might be a negative one, right? And this is very cliche to talk about this now, and we know, and you alluded to the fact that some of the consultancy type conversations are that there's actually challenge around creating change agents, right? We're trying to create advocates for change, and there are known challenges when it comes to doing that. And actually there are some specific things, and there's some real focus that you need on your people to help them and help all of you move on that kind of change journey. I think really understanding your anchor points is quite key, because even when you're digitally transforming, or even when you're going from analog to digital, there are still anchor points that you need. I've talked today about, in my view, successful transformation means understanding what your stable core looks like and then transforming in an agile way adjacent to that core. And then you work on bringing that change in and then effectively growing the core, right? You're not trying to transform the core at any one point in time, because then you're creating a huge amount of disruption. And then it is very, you're creating an unstable function that can then often have all sorts of challenges associated to it. So from a people perspective, understanding that and saying that actually these are our anchor points, this is our core, this is what we're doing. And actually, technology is just going to help us grow. Technology is just going to help you do more for your organization, is a really powerful narrative. And once you get people on board with that, it then becomes very easy to sort of, excuse the cliche, but get them on the bus.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, I guess with any sizable process of change, it's a question of, having priorities, isn't it? I was just wondering, Alexei, what are your priorities this year, if the procurement function at Castle Trust Bank?
Yeah, I think for me this year, procurement really came into its own last year, and the function really kind of came about last year. But I've got the opportunity for a greenfield function, and actually what I'm trying to create are the right business processes and the understanding around what procurement can or can't do for Castle Trust Bank. And then it's really around how can we create a kind of digital first proposition that can allow the business to grow, and actually how can we build a model that is flexible enough that we can kind of grow, expand, we can contract in certain areas, we can grow in other areas. And that's really what I'm trying to land this year, really, is around understanding that core procurement offering, and then really understanding and getting buy-in for how we're going to use technology and how we're going to use microservices and SaaS applications in the right way.
And I mean, you're clearly very passionate about procurement, Alexei. I mean, what is it you most enjoy about working in this area?
I mean, I think, I'm someone that likes to look at lots of different things, and I like to look at things in different ways. And what I'm really love about procurement, and we talked about it earlier, that analogy of like having a shape that doesn't have a defined number of sides, I find really exciting. I love the fact that actually procurement can be lots of different things to lots of different people. And actually, one of the slides that we talked about procurement, wrestling with its value proposition, this kind of, a lot of it is your glass half full or glass half empty. But for me personally, that's a massive opportunity, right? Because then what we're doing is we're saying there are really no limitations. There's no ceiling for procurement. Procurement can do, if we continue to prove that we can provide value to the organization, and we can do something tomorrow that's not being done today, and actually we're creating value for the shareholders, or we're reducing risk for the organization, or we are ensuring that actually from a supplier perspective, our organization is moving further forward, whether that be from an ESG perspective, whether that be from a sustainability perspective or an innovation perspective, then the business is never going to say no. So I love the fact that in procurement we have so much opportunity to drive value across all sorts of different ways, that many of those ways, what procurement will look like in 5 years, we don't really even know today, sat here today. And so for me, that's something that I find really tremendously exciting about working in procurement, and that's always been the case.
Well, I mean, it's great. It's a fantastic thing to enjoy your job, isn't it? And well, Alexei, thank you ever so much for your time today. It's a fascinating insight into a crucial area, really, for most supply chains, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so thank you ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sean.
Now, don't go anywhere. Our next presentation will follow shortly.